So I'm a nonfiction writer. Lost Kingdom is a history of set in 19th century Hawaii. And when I began this project, it was a project really about two families. One, a San Francisco family dynasty, and one, of course, the royal family of Hawaii. And the book was following these families over generations and watching the point at which they intersected, their lives intersected. The San Francisco family is the Spreckles family. We're not very far away from one member of the Spreckles family. In the middle of Union Square, at the very top of that column, is Alma Spreckles. So look up next time you're there, and you may see her. But the scene that I'm going to read to you from is set in Honolulu, and it takes place in 1893. And I want to just describe, before I begin reading, what Honolulu was like at the turn of the century, because it was a pretty interesting place. Like San Francisco, of course, it was a port town, but there were some very important differences. Hawaii, of course, is one of the most remote places in the world. It's 2,500 miles from California, another 2,000 plus miles from Japan, extremely isolated. And its rhythm, the rhythm of the town, really was based on ships coming in and out. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was primarily whalers coming, and they would come from New England, go around Cape Horn, and come into Honolulu and reprovision. We were there, and when new ships would come in, the people would blow conch shells. It's a very distinct sound in the harbor. And kind of the first few decades of the 19th century, the whalers, there was a certain season of the year when they would come, and the ships would be so dense in Honolulu Harbor that there's a Hawaiian chant, and the chant describes the forests of masts in Honolulu. And you could jump from one boat to the next, maybe as many as 500 ships at one time in that harbor, just imagine. By the time of the U.S. Civil War, those whalers had died down a little bit, but still, you know, you had some pretty interesting characters rolling into Honolulu. One of them was Herman Melville, who was on a whaling ship. And he ended up taking a few months off in Honolulu and working as a pin setter in a bowling alley. And he wrote about his experience in the town of Honolulu. And he was not at all flattering about the American missionaries who had first arrived in 1820 and were determined, of course, to save the native Hawaiian souls. And he described their leaders as a junta of ignorant and designing Methodist elders. And you could certainly imagine them in their prim New England-style clothing. Of course, in a port town that was famous for its love of life, and certainly people who, before the missionaries came, were not wearing a lot of clothes like they were. So in any case, this is, to take you back to the scene I'm going to read you, 1893, January. And this is the scene in which the two groups of people collide with each other. One is the primarily white business class of the town of Honolulu. The other is the ruler of Honolulu, named Lili'u Kalani. She was known as Lili'u. So I'll just start with a group, first of all, of men who are gathering because they're very angry at the Queen for attempting to introduce a new constitution. Packed into a one-story armory in downtown Honolulu, a crowd of roughly 1,000 white men were electrified by a speech delivered by Lauren Thurston, a passionate, dark-eyed lawyer whose parents had arrived with the first company of missionaries to the islands. His booming voice reached the back of the hall as he asked, "Has the tropic sun cooled and thinned our blood?" A few hours later, the commander of the USS Boston, a warship stationed in Honolulu Harbor with orders to protect American interests, ordered the landing of 162 American sailors and Marines onto the nearly deserted streets of Honolulu at 5 p.m. on January 16th. The Queen was back at the palace just a few blocks from Honolulu Harbor, having been rebuffed 2 days earlier in her attempt to introduce a new constitution. Hearing the beat of the American military drums, she stepped out onto the veranda and watched from above as the troops marched from the harbor. As they kicked up dust in the unpaved streets, she could see they were heavily weighed down with double belts of cartridges. The sun sank and the skies over Honolulu darkened. The blue-jacketed sailors approached the palace. Beneath the town's newly installed electric street lamps, Liliu could see them pushing a revolving cannon and a fearsome Gatling gun that could rip through a large crowd. Following their movements in the street, she felt fear. Why had the troops landed when everything seemed at peace? The air was heavy with the scent of gardenias. Mosquitoes were drawn to the sweat of the blue-jacketed sailors. As the troops marched past the palace grounds, accompanied by drum rolls, they hoisted their rifles to their shoulders and seemed to point them in the Queen's direction. Were their weapons drawn and ready to fire, as Liliu later recalled, or were they merely signaling their respect for Hawaii's Queen by marching past and beating their drums in a royal salute, as one of their commanding officers later insisted? Whatever their intention, this brash display of military power ignited a crisis that would change the course of American history. The Queen watched the troops facing an impossible dilemma. Should she remain civil and risk her overthrow and the surrender of Native Hawaiian culture and sovereignty? Or should she order the troops under her command, outnumbering the USS Boston's force by nearly 4-1, to fight back? To do so risked inciting the slaughter of a race of people that was already disappearing, decimated over the years by smallpox, syphilis, and measles. Epidemics had carried away tens of thousands of Native Hawaiians who had little resistance to the deadly viruses which kept sweeping through the islands. If her people fought off the Americans, would the British, French, or even possibly the Japanese swoop in to replace them? What should she do? Well, I'm hoping you read my book to find out what happens next. But I will tell you that Liliuokalani was subjected to a brutal propaganda campaign on the mainland. In fact, not far from here, the San Francisco Chronicle was one of the papers calling her a savage, calling her immoral, and calling her far worse than that. She was arrested. She was imprisoned 2 years after that scene. She was found guilty of charges brought against her in a military court. And while all this was happening, she tallied the songs that she had composed over the years. There were more than 100 of them, including the song that's still the best-known Hawaiian song on the mainland, Aloha Oe. And she found it in her heart to compose a hymn of forgiveness towards her enemies at the time when she was under house arrest in the palace. So I thank you very sincerely for listening, and I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.